The package arrived on a Tuesday, unmarked except for my name and a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a cassette tape, the kind nobody uses anymore, wrapped in a yellowed piece of paper with a single sentence scrawled in shaking handwriting. Father Malcolm was right about everything. God forgive us all. Attached to it was a photograph of a small stone church surrounded by dense forest, and on the back, written in the same trembling script, Hollowgrave, Queensland, Australia, 1989. We should have listened. I'm Rebecca Torres, 51 years old, a religious studies professor specializing in cult psychology and isolated religious communities. I've spent 25 years studying what happens when faith becomes pathology, when devotion turns into something darker. But nothing in my academic career prepared me for what I found in Hollowgrave. Nothing prepared me for the truth about what happened to my mother. The cassette tape was recorded on August 14, 1989, exactly 35 years ago. The voice on it was female, young, terrified. She spoke in rushed whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. My name is Sarah Chen. It's 3:47 in the morning. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it out. Father Malcolm tried to warn us 6 months ago, but we called him crazy. We called him a heretic. We were so wrong. The children started changing in May. Little things at first. They stopped playing. They would stand in groups of 7, perfectly still, staring at nothing. When we asked them what they were looking at, they would say, "The light behind the light." We thought it was a game, some kind of childhood phase. By June, they had stopped sleeping. All 43 children in Hollowgrave, ages 3 to 14, would lie in their beds with their eyes open all night, perfectly motionless. Parents would check on them, find them staring at the ceiling, breathing so slowly you could barely tell they were alive. And they were smiling. All of them. The same smile. By July, they stopped eating. They would sit at the dinner table, staring at their plates, not touching the food. But they weren't getting thinner. They weren't getting weaker. If anything, they seemed stronger, more focused, more present. That's when the adults started to understand that something was fundamentally wrong. The tape continued, the woman's voice breaking with suppressed sobs. Father Malcolm returned on July 28th. He'd been gone for 3 months, ever since the congregation voted to remove him from the church. He said he'd been researching, investigating, trying to understand what was happening to us. He gathered everyone in the town hall and told us the truth. He said Hollowgrave wasn't chosen randomly. He said the land we built on, the valley we thought was blessed, was a place the Aboriginal people had avoided for thousands of years. They called it Chukurpa Ngura, the dreaming place. Not a place of good dreams. A place where dreams bled into reality, where the boundary between sleeping and waking was thin. He said our church, St. Bartholomew's, was built directly over a geological formation that amplified electromagnetic fields, that created conditions similar to what scientists call the God helmet effect, mass religious experiences, visions, feelings of divine presence. Except it wasn't divine. It was geological. It was physics. And our children, with their developing brains, were most susceptible to it. I stopped the tape, my hands shaking. Sarah Chen. My mother's maiden name was Sarah Chen. My mother, who died when I was 3 years old, supposedly in a car accident in rural Australia. My mother, who I'd been told almost nothing about, whose past my father refused to discuss, whose photographs had all mysteriously disappeared from our house when I was 7. I rewound and listened again, this time hearing beyond the words. The accent was right. The cadence matched the few recordings I had of my mother's voice from old family videos. This was her. This was my mother, speaking 35 years ago, the night before she died. The tape continued. Father Malcolm said the children weren't sick. They were being affected by the geological formation, their brains essentially rewiring themselves to perceive frequencies that adults couldn't detect anymore. He said if we left immediately, if we evacuated the entire town and never came back, the effects might reverse. But the council didn't believe him. Brother Thomas said it was demonic possession. Sister Maria said it was a test from God. And Pastor William, who had replaced Father Malcolm, said it was a blessing. He said the children were achieving a higher state of consciousness, that they were becoming vessels for divine truth. He convinced the parents to wait, to pray, to have faith. That was our mistake. That was when everything went wrong. There was a long pause on the tape, filled only with the sound of distant singing. Children's voices, dozens of them, singing in perfect harmony. But the melody was wrong, the intervals between notes mathematically impossible, creating harmonics that made my ears hurt even through the old recording. It's August 13th now. Tomorrow is the Assumption of Mary. Pastor William has convinced the congregation that tomorrow night the children will lead us in a mass ascension. He says they've been preparing us, that they've been showing us the path to a higher plane of existence. Half the parents believe him. The other half are too terrified to speak up. I tried to leave today. I took my daughter Rebecca and drove toward the main road. But the children were standing there, all 43 of them, blocking the road. They didn't say anything. They just stood there, smiling, and my car wouldn't start. The engine was fine. The battery was charged. But it wouldn't start. Not until I turned around and drove back to town. I'm hiding now, in the basement of the general store. My daughter is asleep beside me, and I'm grateful she's too young to understand what's happening. If you find this tape, if you find us, please know that we didn't choose this. We were good people who made a terrible mistake. We confused geology with theology. We mistook brain chemistry for divine intervention. And now we're trapped in a place that's changing us, that's rewriting us at a fundamental level. Father Malcolm was right. We should have left when we had the chance. Tomorrow night, whatever Pastor William has planned, I don't think any of us are coming back from it. If you're hearing this, tell my daughter I loved her. Tell her that her mother tried. Tell her that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is faith without reason. The tape ended with the sound of footsteps on wooden stairs, the woman's sharp intake of breath, and then silence. I sat in my apartment in Brisbane, staring at the cassette player, my entire understanding of my past crumbling around me. My mother hadn't died in a car accident. She'd died in Hollowgrave, in whatever happened on August 14th, 1989. And I had been there. I had survived when apparently no one else had. The next day, I began my investigation. Hollowgrave was real, though barely. It appeared on old geological survey maps as a settlement of approximately 200 people in the Queensland rainforest, about 300 kilometers northwest of Brisbane. It had been established in 1978 by a group of Catholic families seeking to create an isolated, faith-based community. By 1989, it was home to 57 families, 214 people total. And then, in August 1989, it ceased to exist. The official records were frustratingly vague. A report from the Queensland Police Service dated August 16, 1989, described it as a mass casualty event of unknown origin. 211 people found dead in and around St. Bartholomew's Church. No signs of violence, no obvious cause of death. Toxicology reports showed nothing. Autopsies revealed no physical trauma. The coroner's final report concluded sudden cardiac arrest, cause unknown, simultaneous occurrence in multiple victims, possibly environmental factors. The 3 survivors were 3 children under the age of 5, found alive but unresponsive, including one Rebecca Chen, age 3. I had no memory of Hollowgrave. My earliest memories began at age 6, living with my father in Sydney, attending a Catholic school where I was known as Rebecca Torres, my father's surname. He told me my mother died in an accident, that it was too painful to discuss, that we needed to move forward. He'd erased my past so completely that I didn't even know I'd had a different last name until I was 18, and needed my birth certificate for university enrollment. When I confronted him about it, he'd said only, "Some things are better forgotten, Rebecca. Your mother wanted you to have a normal life. I'm honoring her wishes." He died of a heart attack when I was 23, taking whatever secrets he knew to the grave. Now, holding my mother's tape, I realized he'd been protecting me from something he couldn't explain, or something he was too terrified to explain. I spent 2 weeks gathering everything I could find about Hollowgrave. Police reports, geological surveys, newspaper articles from 1989. The story had been front-page news for a week, then vanished from public discourse with suspicious speed. The official narrative settled into tragic mass poisoning, possibly environmental toxins, investigation ongoing, and then nothing. No follow-up articles, no final report, no explanation. But in the archives of the University of Queensland, I found something else. A master's thesis from 1992 titled Electromagnetic Anomalies and Reported Paranormal Experiences in Remote Queensland Communities by a graduate student named Michael Rothstein. An entire chapter was devoted to Hollowgrave, though the town was never named directly, just referred to as Site 7. Rothstein had documented the geological formation beneath the area, a rare convergence of underground water systems, mineral deposits rich in magnetite and quartz, and specific topographical features that created a natural electromagnetic field of unusual strength and frequency. He theorized that prolonged exposure, especially for children with developing brains, could cause symptoms similar to temporal lobe epilepsy, religious visions, feelings of divine presence, loss of sense of self, and, in extreme cases, complete dissociative states. His thesis had been rejected by his committee as scientifically unsound and ethically problematic. He never published it. I found Michael Rothstein teaching physics at a community college in Cairns. When I called and mentioned Hollowgrave, there was a long silence. Then, "How did you find me?" I told him about my mother's tape, about being one of the 3 survivors, about needing to understand what happened. Another long silence. "Can you come to Cairns?" I don't discuss this over the phone. 3 days later, I sat across from Michael Rothstein in his cluttered office. He was 68 now, gray and weathered, but his eyes were sharp. He studied me carefully before speaking. "You don't remember anything?" I shook my head. "Nothing before age 6. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "That's probably for the best. The other 2 survivors, they don't remember either. The human brain is very good at protecting itself from trauma it can't process, especially young brains." He pulled out a file box from beneath his desk, old and battered. I was 25 in 1989, just starting my graduate research. My focus was on geological factors in religious experiences. When Hollowgrave happened, I was one of the first researchers allowed on site. What I saw there, it changed the course of my life. It ended my academic career. But I've never stopped trying to understand it. He opened the box and pulled out photographs. Aerial shots of a valley surrounded by dense rainforest. A small town with neat houses, a church with a tall steeple, streets arranged in a perfect grid. Then closer shots. The church steps covered with bodies, people lying as if they'd simply fallen asleep. No panic, no struggle, just stopped. 211 people died in approximately a 4-hour window on the night of August 14th, 1989, Michael said quietly. The police found them the next morning. Most were in or around the church. Some were in their homes. A few were in the street, as if they'd been walking and just stopped. All of them had the same expression: peaceful. Almost blissful. The 3 surviving children were found in different locations. You were in a basement hidden by your mother. The other 2 were in homes, apparently forgotten in the chaos. You were all unresponsive for days, but you recovered. Physically, at least. He showed me more photographs. Geological surveys, electromagnetic field readings, brain scan images. The formation under Hollowgrave created an electromagnetic field that pulsed at a frequency between 7 and 8 hertz. That's the same frequency as theta brainwaves, the state of deep meditation and dreaming. For people living there continuously, especially children, their brains essentially synchronized with the field. They were in a constant state between waking and dreaming. And in that state, they were susceptible to suggestion, to shared visions, to collective hallucinations that felt more real than reality. Father Malcolm Flynn was the original pastor of St. Bartholomew's, Michael continued. He was also an amateur geologist. He started noticing the effects after about 6 months: heightened religious experiences, congregants reporting visions and voices, a general sense of spiritual euphoria. At first, he thought it was genuine divine intervention, but then he started documenting the patterns. The visions always happened in certain locations. The experiences intensified during certain times of day, when the electromagnetic field was strongest. And the children were affected most severely. By early 1989, Father Malcolm realized what was happening wasn't spiritual, it was environmental. He tried to convince the congregation to leave, to relocate the community. They thought he'd lost his faith. They removed him from his position and installed William Thorne, a charismatic preacher who believed the experiences were miraculous. Michael's hands shook as he pulled out a final photograph. It showed the interior of the church, bodies arranged in neat rows on the pews, all facing the altar. At the altar stood 43 children, positioned in a perfect circle, hands joined, eyes closed. This is how they were found: the children at the altar, the adults in the pews. According to the few journal entries and letters we recovered, Pastor Thorne had convinced the congregation that the children were going to lead them in a mass ascension, a communal experience of divine ecstasy. What actually happened was mass simultaneous death from what we think was a kind of fatal seizure induced by the electromagnetic field at its peak intensity. I stared at the photograph, trying to feel something, any connection to this place where I'd spent the first 3 years of my life. But there was nothing, just a distant horror at the waste of it all. Why did the three of us survive? Michael leaned back in his chair. You were all under 5 years old. Your brains were still developing, more plastic, more able to disconnect from the field's influence. And you weren't in the church during the event. You were hidden, shielded by concrete and earth. Your mother saved you, Rebecca. She understood what was going to happen, and she made sure you wouldn't be there. He paused. There's something else you should know. After Hollowgrave, the Australian government quietly bought all the land. They demolished every building, removed every structure, and declared the entire valley a restricted ecological preserve. You can't visit it. It's illegal to enter the area. They claimed it was to protect endangered species, but we both know it was to make sure nothing like this could happen again. I spent that night in a Cairns hotel, unable to sleep, listening to my mother's tape over and over. Her voice, young and scared, trying to save her daughter from something she barely understood. She'd been 26 years old, the same age I was when I defended my doctoral thesis on cult psychology. Had she sensed the irony, trying to escape from what was essentially a cult, formed not by charismatic manipulation, but by geological accident? The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to see Hollowgrave. I needed to stand in the place where my mother died and 210 other people lost their lives to a lethal combination of faith and physics. Michael tried to dissuade me. It's restricted for a reason, Rebecca. The electromagnetic field is still there. It's not safe. But I was done living with gaps in my memory, with questions that had no answers. I hired a local guide, a man named Tom who knew the rainforest and didn't ask too many questions when I paid him well. We set out on a Tuesday morning, driving as far as the roads would take us, then hiking the rest of the way. The rainforest was dense, primal, beautiful in a way that felt indifferent to human concerns. It took us 6 hours to reach the valley where Hollowgrave had been. The government had done a thorough job. There were no buildings, no streets, no sign that 200 people had once lived here. Nature had reclaimed everything with aggressive speed, but the valley itself was unmistakable. The shape of the land matched the aerial photographs, the creek running through it identical to the maps. And there, in the center of the valley, was a flat area covered in new-growth trees, their trunks thin and uniform. The footprint of St. Bartholomew's Church. Tom waited at the valley's edge while I walked toward the church site. As I got closer, I started to feel it. A low hum, not audible but sensed, like standing too close to high-voltage power lines. A pressure behind my eyes, a sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with the terrain. I understood immediately why the government had restricted the area. The field was still active, still pulsing at frequencies that human brains weren't meant to process continuously. I stood where the altar would have been and closed my eyes. And suddenly, unexpectedly, I remembered. Not everything. Not the daily life of Hollowgrave or my first 3 years. But I remembered that night, August 14th, 1989. I remembered my mother carrying me, running through dark streets, her breath coming in gasps. I remembered her hiding me in a basement, whispering, "Stay quiet, stay hidden, don't come out no matter what you hear." I remembered the singing starting, those mathematically impossible harmonies that hurt to hear. I remembered waiting in the dark, terrified, as the singing grew louder and then suddenly stopped. And I remembered the silence that followed, absolute and terrible. I opened my eyes, tears streaming down my face. My mother had died saving me. She'd understood that whatever was happening in that church would kill everyone present, and she'd made sure I wasn't there. She'd sacrificed her chance to escape so that I would live. I stayed in that valley for 3 hours, walking its perimeter, trying to feel some connection to the community that had died here. But what I felt instead was a profound sadness at the waste of it all. 211 people who'd sought spiritual fulfillment and found only a geological anomaly that mimicked the experience of the divine. A community that confused electromagnetic fields with the hand of God. A charismatic preacher who led his flock to their deaths because he couldn't distinguish between faith and delusion. And a lone dissenting voice, Father Malcolm Flynn, who'd understood the truth but couldn't make anyone listen. I tried to find Father Malcolm after I returned to Brisbane. I discovered he died in 1997, alone in a small apartment in Melbourne. His obituary was brief. Former priest, survived by no immediate family, services private. But I found something else. A manuscript he'd been working on before his death, held in the archives of the Melbourne Archdiocese. It was titled, "When God is Geology, a Cautionary Tale of Faith and Reason." The Archbishop granted me permission to read it, though he made it clear the church had no intention of ever publishing it. The manuscript was devastating in its honesty. Father Malcolm detailed everything: his growing realization that the religious experiences in Hollowgrave were environmentally induced, his desperate attempts to evacuate the community, his guilt at failing to save them. But the final chapter was what haunted me. It was titled, "The Children." In it, Father Malcolm described what he'd observed in the months before the tragedy. The children of Hollowgrave hadn't just been affected by the electromagnetic field, they'd been transformed by it. Their brain development had synchronized so completely with the field that they'd essentially become a collective consciousness, 43 individual children functioning as parts of a single organism. They didn't plan it, they didn't understand it. They were children, and their developing brains had adapted to the environment they were in, the way brains do. But the adaptation was pathological, unsustainable. Father Malcolm theorized that on August 14th, the collective consciousness the children had formed reached a critical threshold. In trying to bring the adults into their shared experience, to synchronize everyone in Hollowgrave to the same frequency, they'd essentially overloaded the neural systems of everyone present. The adults died instantly. The children, already adapted to the field, died more slowly. And the 3 youngest children, not yet fully integrated into the collective, survived. Father Malcolm's final entry was dated March 1997, 2 months before his death. "I failed them all. I saw what was happening and couldn't stop it. The tragedy of Hollowgrave isn't that people died. The tragedy is that they died believing they were ascending to heaven when they were actually experiencing a mass neurological event. They died in ecstasy, convinced they were touching the divine, when in reality they were just responding to electromagnetic pulses from rocks and water. There is no greater cruelty than giving someone a false transcendence. I pray for their souls, and I pray that their story serves as a warning. Faith without reason is not faith, it's vulnerability. Devotion without discernment is not devotion, it's danger. And the search for the divine must always be tempered with humility about what we don't understand. God does not live in geological formations, but human beings, desperate for meaning and connection, will find God anywhere, even in the places where he isn't." I closed the manuscript with shaking hands. Father Malcolm had carried this burden for 8 years after Hollowgrave, trying to process what had happened, trying to find meaning in meaningless tragedy. And in the end, he died alone, his warnings unheeded, his manuscript unpublished. I spent the next year piecing together the full story. I interviewed the other 2 survivors, now in their late 30s, both of whom had no memory of Hollowgrave but had lived their entire lives with a vague sense of loss they couldn't explain. I spoke with the adult children of Hollowgrave's victims, people like me who'd grown up without parents, raised by relatives who couldn't explain what had really happened. I obtained the sealed police reports through Freedom of Information requests, and found that investigators had suspected the truth, but were pressured to accept the official narrative of environmental poisoning. I documented everything in a book titled The Hollowgrave Event, When Faith Becomes Fatal. It was published by an academic press and sold modestly, but it opened conversations. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth that religious experience could be induced, manipulated, and weaponized by environmental factors. It raised questions about how many other miracles or divine experiences throughout history might have been geological or neurological phenomena that people interpreted through the lens of their beliefs. And most importantly, it gave names and faces to the 211 people who died in Hollowgrave. They weren't just statistics or cautionary tales. They were real people who'd sought community and meaning, and had been betrayed by their own brain's vulnerability to environmental manipulation. On the 35th anniversary of the Hollowgrave event, I organized a memorial service. It was held in Brisbane, attended by about 50 people, relatives of victims, researchers who'd studied the case, journalists who'd covered the story. We erected a small memorial plaque with all 211 names, and we told their stories. We remembered them not as victims of their own ignorance, but as people who'd made the very human mistake of mistaking correlation for causation, of seeing patterns where none existed, of believing so deeply in something that they couldn't see the mundane explanation beneath the miraculous appearance. I spoke about my mother, Sarah Chen, who died at 26 trying to save her daughter from a danger she barely understood. I played portions of her tape, her young voice warning future listeners to question, to investigate, to never confuse faith with certainty. And I read Father Malcolm's final words, his plea for faith tempered with reason, for devotion balanced with discernment. After the service, an elderly woman approached me. She was 83, thin and frail, but her eyes were clear. "I'm Catherine Flynn," she said. "Father Malcolm was my brother. I've been waiting for years for someone to tell this story properly. Thank you." She handed me a sealed envelope. "He left this for whoever finally had the courage to expose the truth. I think he'd want you to have it." Inside the envelope was a letter, dated 1997 in Father Malcolm's handwriting. "To whoever reads this, Hollowgrave was not an anomaly. It was a warning. Throughout human history, we've built sacred sites on geological formations that produce altered states of consciousness. Delphi, Stonehenge, countless cathedrals and temples. We mistook the effects of geology for the presence of the divine. We still do. The electromagnetic fields, the infrasound, the way certain spaces amplify religious experience. None of it is magic, it's physics. But physics, when misunderstood, becomes indistinguishable from the supernatural. I don't say this to diminish faith. I say it to protect it. Real faith doesn't need geological assistance. Real faith isn't dependent on feeling a certain way in a certain place. Real faith is a choice made in the absence of proof, a commitment to live according to certain principles even when the universe gives us no signs. The people of Hollowgrave had real faith once, but they let that faith become dependent on the feelings they experienced in that valley. And when those feelings intensified, they mistook pathology for prophecy. Learn from their mistake. Question your experiences. Test your revelations. Never assume that what feels divine is divine. And remember that the most dangerous place in the world is one where everyone believes the same thing with absolute certainty. God bless you. Father Malcolm Flynn. I carry that letter with me now, 3 years after the memorial service. I still teach religious studies, still research cult psychology and isolated communities, but my focus has shifted. I study the intersection of neuroscience and spirituality, the way human brains create religious experiences, the physiological basis of mystical states, not to disprove faith, but to understand it, to separate the genuine from the induced, the chosen from the compelled. Hollowgrave taught me that the line between revelation and delusion is thinner than we want to believe, that what feels most true can be most false, that communities bound by shared certainty can become death traps, and that sometimes the most faithful act is to question what everyone else accepts. My mother's tape sits in a climate-controlled archive now, preserved for researchers and historians, but I have a copy that I listen to once a year, on August 14th. I listen to her young voice, scared but determined, fighting to save her daughter's life with the only tools she had, a tape recorder and the truth. She was 26 years old. She should have had decades more life. Instead, she died in a valley where geology masqueraded as God and faith became fatal. I think about the 43 children often, the ones who became a collective consciousness without meaning to, who synchronized into something that wasn't quite human anymore. Were they scared at the end? Did they understand what was happening to them? Or did they die in that same blissful state the adults did, convinced they were ascending to something greater? I'll never know. But I know this. They were children, and they deserved better. They deserved adults who could distinguish between miracle and geology, between divine intervention and neurological phenomena. They deserved a community that valued questions as much as answers. The valley where Hollowgrave stood is still restricted, still quiet except for the sounds of the rainforest reclaiming what was briefly taken from it. The electromagnetic field still pulses at theta wave frequencies, still capable of inducing the same effects that killed 211 people 35 years ago. The government has discussed destroying the formation, using controlled explosives to disrupt the geological convergence that creates the field. But they haven't done it yet. Perhaps because deep down, we're all still drawn to places that make us feel something beyond ourselves. Perhaps because the temptation to mistake geology for God is stronger than our commitment to safety. I understand that temptation now. Standing in that valley, feeling the hum of the electromagnetic field, I felt something I can only describe as presence. A sense that the universe was paying attention, that I was connected to something larger than myself. It felt divine. It felt meaningful. It felt like coming home. And it was just rocks and water and electromagnetic frequencies interacting with my temporal lobe. That's the horror of Hollowgrave. Not that people died, but that they died feeling something beautiful. Not that they were deceived, but that the deception felt like truth. Not that they had faith, but that their faith was rewarded with feelings so powerful they couldn't imagine questioning them. My mother questioned. In her final hours, trapped in a community racing toward destruction, she chose doubt over certainty. She chose to save her daughter over joining the collective ecstasy. And that act of doubt, that moment of questioning what everyone else accepted, saved my life. I teach my students now, be suspicious of certainty. Be wary of places and people that make you feel too much. Real transcendence doesn't need geological assistance. Real faith doesn't require electromagnetic fields. And real wisdom is knowing the difference between what feels true and what is true. Hollowgrave stands as a monument to that distinction. 211 people who confused feeling with fact. 43 children who adapted to their environment in ways that killed them. One dissenting priest who understood the truth but couldn't save anyone. And 3 survivors who carry the burden of remembering so that others might learn. The last recording on my mother's tape is something I didn't notice for months. After her final words, after the footsteps on the stairs, there are 30 seconds of silence. And then, very faintly, you can hear it. The children singing. Those impossible harmonies, those frequencies that hurt to hear. And beneath it, barely audible, my mother's voice one last time. Rebecca, if you ever hear this, know that I love you. And know that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from what everyone else believes is true. Don't let anyone tell you that doubt is weakness. Doubt is survival. Question everything, even this. The tape ends there, with the sound of singing growing louder, and then silence. She died that night, along with everyone else who stayed in that valley. She died knowing she'd saved her daughter. And she left me a legacy more valuable than any faith. The courage to question, the wisdom to doubt, the strength to stand apart. That's what I carry from Hollowgrave. Not memories of the place, not personal connection to the community, but my mother's final gift. Permission to be uncertain in a world that demands conviction. Permission to question in a culture that valorizes faith. Permission to walk away from what everyone else insists is true. Hollowgrave was a place where God lived in the rocks, where divine experience was manufactured by electromagnetic fields, where faith and geology became indistinguishable. And it killed everyone who couldn't tell the difference. I survived because my mother could tell the difference, because she chose reason over revelation, doubt over certainty, and her daughter's survival over her own salvation. 35 years later, I stand as living proof that sometimes the most faithful act is faithlessness, that sometimes survival requires betraying what everyone else believes, that sometimes the only way to escape a dying community is to stop believing what holds that community together. The valley is still there, still humming with electromagnetic frequencies, still capable of making people feel divine presence. But it's empty now, except for trees and birds, and the ghosts of people who mistook physics for prophecy. And somewhere in the Queensland rainforest, marked by no monument and visited by no one, is the place where my mother made her final choice. Save her daughter, or die with her community. She chose me. She chose doubt. She chose survival over salvation. And in doing so, she gave me the only inheritance that matters. The knowledge that it's okay to question, okay to walk away, okay to choose life over faith when faith demands death. That's the legacy of Hollowgrave. Not that faith is dangerous, but that unquestioned faith is fatal. Not that we shouldn't seek the divine, but that we must be careful where we look for it. Not that community is bad, but that communities built on shared certainty can become collective graves. My mother knew this. Father Malcolm knew this, and now you know this too. Question everything, trust doubt, and never mistake the feeling of transcendence for transcendence itself. Sometimes God is just geology, and sometimes the most sacred act is having the courage to walk away.